Okay, we are back with a new tape, and now we'll be lucky enough to actually hear some Irish language, which some of you may be hearing for the first time. So with that, I'll turn it back to you and ask you to read a couple of poems for us, and perhaps you could provide a little introduction to the background of each poem.
Well, do you want me to start with some of the poems from the earlier tradition?
Sure.
Okay, because they're going to need a little bit of a preface, more so than the more modern poems. We were talking earlier on in the interview about the various stages of development of the language, and one of the first things we said was that the first sort of ability to record literature was when Christianity arrived and brought with it the Roman alphabet. And those developments happened 1,500 years ago now, let's say, 1,600 years ago. So let's just take an analogy from English so that people know where we're coming from here. The way we speak English nowadays is radically different from the English of Shakespeare, who's only roughly about 500 years old. And some of these poems, these earlier ones particularly, go back to the 8th and 9th century. So the language as it's recorded in these particular poems will be pronounced radically differently from the modern pronunciation, although your listeners may not be so much aware of that. I'm saying that because I might find it slightly more difficult to read these earlier poems, and I'm not sure that they'll be exactly right, but they'll be accurate enough to give your listeners and your viewers a good idea of how the Irish language sounds.
Perfect.
This particular poem, which is entitled in Irish Tuil in Rí, which translates as the will of God, is found in various manuscripts that date from the 12th century roughly. It's the earliest version of the poem is found in the Book of Leinster, but it dates from an earlier period, and it goes back to what you were saying about the oral versus the written tradition. Very often poems which were not written down at the time they were composed and in ready use were handed on word perfect from generation to generation until they were eventually written down. And how we know that a poem that appears, let's say, in a 13th or 14th century manuscript belongs to a much earlier era is because the language, we have enough evidence from earlier fragments to identify the language with that earlier period. So that accounts for the disparity between the age of the manuscript and the age of the actual poem. But this particular poem is about, it sort of expresses the poet's feeling that God will reward those who follow closely his will, and also, you know, that some people will suffer if they don't follow the rule of law that God has laid down for us. But it's a very powerful poem, it's a very moving poem about the relationship between the poet and his devotion to God. So it goes like this: Is oor mlan, is nev grain, is lester nergid coffeen, is angel, is egn and naive, gachain to gni tuil in rí. Is ein nead the sauce, is náut hall dian peshlin guas, is lester fas, is crowned cream, nad diena tuil in rí guas. Is crave chumra gon the blath, is lester is lan da vil, is lia logver com well, dogni tuil mac day donyev. Is knu chech nad vi amoin, is bring brain, is crowned cream. Is crave iadavla ken vla, kach nad diene tuil in rí. Dani tuil mac day donyev. Is green etracht mi sav, is ardde de donyev, is lester lunide lan. Is ech boede tar mag rei, far ad kostnai fat de woord, is carpet feather for rig, de ver boe the half oor. Is green gores richard naive, verdien budach en remor, is temple sonne de seer, is green naive connothang cor. Is altar for snaltir fin, imma canner railer cor, is caille glanda collin, is findrin je find, is or. The next poem is called Congar an Ishe, and it's entitled in English The Lark Sings, and it's a poem by an ancient Irish monk who's coming out of a cell and looks up, hears the lark singing, and it inspires a sort of spiritual connection with the heavens in him. Congar an Ishe Olach, Teid Neach Amach Di Afegid, Kadagar an Yin Genyach, Tuas for Nev Ninyach Nielach. Gave it some Mahalma, Nev Naimri Ninyach, Dum Didin Ken Anath, Glaneth Machinyath. And the next one that you asked me to read is by a medieval or a later medieval poet called Guillermo o Hoasa. And this is a little poem where the poet asks, it appears in the beginning of the book, the poet asks people to reflect on the contents of the book because their salvation depends on it. Leche an Ciarán Veg, Fech an Topper Oldanig, Ille Harfe ina a Hevshi, Wimet Hanema an Obershe, and Kishe Treir Hanley Far, and Farin in their Fulju, ik saw an Farin in the Will, Nyawon dan noch a Jager, and Yewen Treir Yultinje, Shalav a Haku Dalwi, a Vechter Di, and Fong the Will, the Yevter son in Askai. Ik saw an ish the Nyev Hugov, Sra Grienach Yam Garvogel, Tagish Hertige Jay doing. Trim chatted the skei and scriptor. Ni hug some roiv, ni son, fairu an eric yriani, and nia a lochopper na ya, kia an fosruga nach furshit. Ni yarnsiv near yent the gov, darach a le dalrav briher, brin yam gars a niefa onyev, brihere dalriche an duliv. The horu briher daming, more yiv a hiech the chering. Convoit feilige goede kloch, ordel na feine a volach. Rollen na veeg o jager, kaart de ruiche on dulewan, dit tig an skeep de schreef mij, schreef heen a gaartje dit greg. The next couple of poems come from the modern tradition, which means we're up to 20th, 21st century poems, and the language, the sounds will be easier on the ear and will be easier for me to read too. This particular one is called Nasulia Unya. It's by one of our well-known female poets, born in England but of Kerry extraction. And this one is about, it's a kind of it's a reflection on the Garden of Paradise and the struggle between Adam and Eve. Solar Luke Stulia Unya and Nahar Nieves Nuignius, the Rinky Fada Andalushacha Kircha Clive, is goody tafata ag dinu glór mar hor cabashte solar glúg na Sulia Unya. Solar lúb sé lúb na lúb is sísar branch na núl cúra, the hati pecacha fi chleti piasún is bati drain fi lag crenever, the cali láis is dirichlú a rédach, solar lúb sé sísar jégal. Solar is sé grim den úlan, fi crepi I goscail te ní chéile, the cawlan nachtu fi scali iche, the grúi grúa ar gach lánuan on the sédig eintel brec near chéile, le dahana gréine, ag mingari solar winche grim den úlan. Ach anis tan grim bunche, and túl itche, and chrib gintche, ar gosan nitche, is tamid litje sa dolach the shiri, mar will golas garthil, is diachan fiacal, go heribel temple. This is a very short poem by, again, one of our modern poets, Carlo Sharkey, who's from the Donegal, northwestern Gaeilge in the island. And this is just a short reflection on life in the rural countryside and how there's a spiritual aspect to it. Idirant smuinniu agus an brichar ta dúchi air agus ceolh, ach be mishelim a bheo, ag cascart an taca, ag scapu bheo, ag gréasuas ag gréanú le gaiche tintri mo chrí, onas go duci tú fósam lá, tusa nachhfuil onat ach scail. And the second last one is really a very famous spiritual prayer. It's called Lúrach Fádrig, which translates as St. Patrick's breastplate. And the Lúrach or the Lorica were spiritual poems or prayer poems that the native Irish believed to have a kind of an armorial effect. There were breastplates against the evil one and against sin. This is a very famous one which has been used as the basis for hymns and reflections in various different ways. Christ Liam, Christ Roan, Christ the Maye, Christ the Stayanam, Christ Fuam, Christ Ost Machan, Christ Ermalive Yas, Christ Ermalive Clay, Christ Im Luidu, Christ Im Hidu, Christ Im Hasudu, Christ the Grigach Dinja Ta Kevnu Arm, Christ the Mailgach Dinja Alaurian Yam, Christ the Ngach Sula Echen Arm, Christ the Ngach Pluish Eishtin Yam. And the very last one is a poem by Cathal O'Sharkey, in which he tells in the first verse of his sadness at the loss of a pet sheep as a young boy. It dies, it falls over the edge of a cliff and struggles for life before it finally dies. And he describes his heartbreak over the loss of that sheep. And in the second verse, he transforms that, or moves that story or that image onto the metaphor for the status of the language as it currently is, and his fears for the future of the Irish language. It's a very powerful poem. The translation of the poem was done by Seamus Heaney, and it in its own right is a particularly powerful piece as well. So we finish with this one. Cuinu, a givne ma wahar. Cuin me na kalyatachi erucht ma wahara, and la a wasi molly. Pat at the hand cleara, is the giragacha crocht in the behi. A cuirtu a vi modula marawanta sauri, is brew anala or in Bertie Jerasu na Gaeilge, sheer on the haltracha, nur a timojan marafaks ne banadilla yapa. Pirechan hua and a squeakia heach in the baha, Grimmy and J. Jerry Ashti, the Hrad Hoskara Hawain, is gan anin yiri hartala horchashi, he's snishkalpaha. Ni hockey me hasuks and tachtig tak trium, the ashkrin a hocht me is the casu machalium. Gediger churus and rachta di oechter macri. Jumper a wally me and shinner a gunyachi, a gallook and yenity capri aran preti. In you tamahangi exihru and wash, ansak navilli, tangi ar nairacha, gaffa a gragacha crocht in the valley, is ganani a hearty la dasacht. Clinium nishmahani jaranacha is neheniha kirechik tacht gotapui. An nobba Christach a rei hon felje. O, da ligachi liu a wine galje. Liu kaha a charun a krachadori hon raha. A shohi I krachnu, shohi I Gaeilge. Níl ma waharan shalame a huvnu a hilju. Agus ni yeni galu and fian a wilju.
That was great. And how does one say thank you in modern Irish?
Gurra Mayagat.
Gurra Mayagat.
Half-wise to road.
Thanks again.